There was something special about that bench by the lake. It wasn't the weathered wood nor the shade from the trees. It was the silence, a silence that didn't unsettle. It embraced. Claire had chosen that bench on the first day she left the house with her violin strapped to her back, unsure if she'd ever be able to play it again. Ever since losing her mother, music had turned into absence. Playing meant remembering, and remembering hurt. The city park seemed like a safe place to go unnoticed. People rushed by, couples shared benches, children chased pigeons. No one paid attention to a 26-year-old woman sitting with a closed case on her lap and her eyes fixed on the water. It was on that day that she saw him for the first time. In the distance between the reflections of the late afternoon light, a dark shape cut across the lake's surface. A swan, black, majestic, alone, while the other white swans swam in groups, accepting bits of bread tossed by giggling children. This one stayed apart. He glided with an arched neck and watchful eyes. Anyone who got too close was met with a flare of wings, as if he were casting the world away. Claire didn't move. She simply watched in silence. Days passed and she returned to the same spot, at the same hour, in the same quiet. The swan was always there, always alone, always on guard. One afternoon, an older woman feeding the duck said to another, "That one where no one gets near him. They say he attacked a man once. He's dangerous. Best to keep your distance." Claire heard it, but she kept watching. That night, when she opened her violin case for the first time since the last day they had been together, her hands trembled. Inside, tucked between the cloth and the strings, was still her mother's handkerchief, the one she used to clean the instrument after every practice. It was white with blue edges and small initials embroidered by hand, M. She didn't play that night, nor the next. But something within her was beginning to want to speak again, even if only to the black swan. The following afternoon, Claire returned to the park with her violin case on her back and her heart restless. There was something different about that day. For the first time, she wasn't there just to observe. The bench by the lake was empty. The trees swayed gently and the sound of water lapping against the shore carried a melody of its own. The black swan was already there, as always, solitary, distant from the others, waiting, or perhaps simply existing in his usual state of watchful stillness. Claire sat down slowly, placed the case beside her and opened it carefully. Inside, next to the instrument, lay the handkerchief that had belonged to her mother. It had always been there, but now it carried the weight of a memory still alive. She took out the violin and bow, adjusted her posture, and placed her fingers in position. She drew a deep breath, and with a delicacy that bordered on shyness, she began to play. The melody was soft, hesitant in its first measures. It wasn't a performance once it was a whisper, a tentative effort to reach something she herself didn't yet understand. The music drifted through the park's quiet and touched the surface of the lake. The swan, which had been drifting aimlessly, paused. Slowly he turned toward the sound. For a brief moment, Claire felt he was listening, not just with his ears, but with something deeper. But his reaction came swiftly. With a violent flap of his wings, he surged through the water, letting out a harsh cry. Some children screamed and ran backward. A man pulled his daughter away by the arm. Disapproving glances turned toward the young violinist. "He's dangerous," a woman exclaimed. "That animal shouldn't be loose." Claire stopped playing. She lowered the bow gently, without responding to the comments. The swan now circled the water aggressively, agitated, as if guarding against an invisible threat. But she didn't move. She simply wiped the violin with her mother's handkerchief and placed it back in the case just as she'd done since she was a child. Not once did she look at the others. Her gaze remained on him, the solitary creature everyone feared. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," she whispered. That night at home, Claire wrote a few lines in an old notebook, words she shared with no one. He feels too, people just don't have the patience to wait for his time. And then she drew a new score. A melody, softer, slower, like a conversation between two silences. She knew she'd go back. The next day, Claire arrived at the park a little later. She had hesitated for hours, debating whether or not to return, But something pulled her back to that bench by the lake, the same one where, just the day before, she had felt fear and serenity at once. The sky was slightly overcast, and a gentle breeze swept through the air. There were fewer people in the park that late afternoon. A man read a newspaper on a bench across the path, and an elderly woman watched the ducks nearby, tossing small crumbs to the ground with slow, deliberate motions. The black swan was there. This time Claire didn't take out her violin right away. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and simply stayed there, in silence. The animal seemed calmer. It swam slowly near the shore, as if mapping the space around it. Its damp feathers reflected the pale evening light, tracing a golden outline across its dark body. After a few minutes, Claire opened the case, handling it with care, but instead of playing immediately, she gently wiped the strings with a cloth. It was a ritual her mother had taught her. Before you play for others, clean it, as if you're playing for yourself. With the white handkerchief, blue-edged and still folded on the lid, she took a deep breath and began to play. The music was different from the first day, less complex, more intimate. The notes drifted through the air as if they were made not to disturb. The swan noticed. It didn't swim away, nor did it charge. It paused, remaining still for long seconds before slowly gliding forward, cutting across the water's surface in absolute silence. Claire kept playing. The elderly woman was watching now. Sitting on a stone bench beneath a tree, she smiled warmly, folding her hands in her lap like someone witnessing something precious unfold before her. At the end of the piece, Claire lowered her bow and looked out at the lake. The swan was near the shore, neck raised, watching. "You stayed," she whispered. She didn't try to approach. She packed up her violin, stood, and gave a small bow in the swan's direction. He didn't react, but he didn't retreat either. As she left the park, the older woman approached with slow steps. "There's something about him that touches you deep inside, isn't there?" Claire nodded, moved. "I think he's just waiting for someone who'll play in his time." The woman smiled with her eyes. "Keep coming back. He's already begun to listen." From that day on, Claire began returning to the park every late afternoon, always at the same time, always to the same bench. Her violin case had become an extension of her body, and her mother's handkerchief, folded carefully beside the strings, no longer felt like a symbol of grief but of living memory. The swan was always there too. Sometimes he swam in slow circles. Sometimes he remained still, like a black sculpture atop the lake's surface. He never came too close, but he never drifted far either. When Claire began to play, he would turn toward her and listen in silence, as if absorbing each note without judgment, simply existing with her. It was an unchoreographed dance, a quiet exchange of presence and sound. The elderly woman had started sitting regularly on the bench nearby, never interrupting. She watched with the same reverence one might give to a silent prayer. One afternoon, she murmured softly, "When you play, he listens with his whole body, as if he's remembering something he's never lived." Claire smiled gently. "I feel that way too, sometimes." The days became part of a quiet rhythm. Claire would arrive, sit and play. The swan would listen. Sometimes he stayed near the edge. Other times he floated directly in front of the stone platform where she rested. The silence between them was enough. One evening Claire returned home, and instead of playing a familiar piece, she began to compose. A melody of her own, inspired by the swan's slow movements, the woman's quiet gestures, the reflection of light on water. The composition came in fragments, but it held something no other music she had played ever did: listening. She kept the radio off, the windows open, and repeated sections on the violin like someone shaping a story with their hands. She played for him, even from afar. With every note, she felt something inside being rebuilt. It wasn't just about overcoming her mother's absence. It was about understanding that pain doesn't have to be denied to be transformed. The black swan had become a mirror of her own solitude, and at the same time, her most unexpected answer. One afternoon in the park, as she finished playing, Claire noticed something new. The swan tilted his head and lowered his neck slightly, a subtle gesture but full of meaning. It was as if he were saying, "I see you." And she responded only with a smile. No words, just the sound that lingers after the silence. Claire's composition was nearly complete. It didn't have a name, but it had soul. It was made of long pauses, notes that drifted lightly, and others that lingered like a prolonged whisper. She played it every night at home, windows open, hoping the sound would drift beyond the walls. Deep down, she wished he could hear it, even from afar. One afternoon, while tuning her violin at the park, she was approached by a young woman wearing a badge from the city's Department of Culture. She had seen Claire play a few times, and, enchanted by the presence of the Swan, was part of the team organizing an open-air concert in the park for independent musicians. "We're looking for something special, and, honestly, your story is already a performance on its own." Claire remained silent. The invitation moved her, but it also stirred old fears. Standing before an audience, being watched, playing while knowing people might expect more from her than she was ready to give. The young woman thanked her gently and asked her to think it over. The next day, as Claire played her new melody, the black swan slowly approached the shore. He wasn't agitated nor defensive. He simply floated calmly, as if each note traced an invisible path across the water. The elderly woman, now sitting closer than ever, watched with tearful eyes. "He knows it's for him," she said after the piece ended. Claire looked at her, surprised. "The music. He hears it differently, because it comes from a place he knows too. Solitude." The young woman hesitated. "I was invited to play here. At the concert." "And what's holding you back?" Claire sighed. "I guess I'm not sure I'm ready to be heard by everyone." "Then play for just one," the woman said, smiling. "The rest will understand." That sentence echoed in Claire's mind for hours. That night, she made her decision. She reread the score slowly, made a few small adjustments, and for the first time gave the melody a name. Presence. Not because the Swan was always there, but because he stayed when no one else did. The sun was beginning to set as the first guests started filling the benches arranged in a circle around the central area of the park. The stage was simple, a wooden platform surrounded by trees and fallen leaves. Small string lights hung above, casting a gentle glow like stars suspended in the branches. Claire arrived with her violin case on her back and her heart tight. Her steps were steady, but her chest was restless, the sound of people chatting, musicians tuning their instruments, organizers adjusting chairs. It all felt distant. What truly weighed on her was the inner silence that formed just before stepping on stage. The elderly woman waited for her in the front row. When Claire passed by, she didn't say a word. She simply smiled with her eyes, as if she already knew what was about to happen. The announcer introduced her kindly. "And now, a quiet presence who has moved us for days in this park. Claire with an original composition. Presence." Claire walked to the center of the stage, violin in hand. The white handkerchief with blue edges lay neatly folded atop the open case beside her. The audience grew silent. She closed her eyes and began. The first notes were slow, nearly imperceptible. The melody drifted like a breeze, gently filling the space. Every stroke of the bow, every vibrato, carried months of pain, silence, and transformation. And then it happened. From the other side of the lake, someone pointed quietly. A dark silhouette glided across the water, moving slowly, but without hesitation. The black swan. Claire didn't stop playing. The animal approached the shore and, with deliberate steps, emerged from the water. He walked to the edge of the stage and stood there, steady, like a sentinel. The crowd held its breath. No one spoke. No one laughed. It was as if time had paused. Claire opened her eyes and saw him. She kept playing. The final notes were slower, a whisper of farewell. When the sound faded, the swan gently bowed his head, eyes fixed on her. In return, she tilted her head as well, a gesture of recognition, of mutual respect. The first applause came soft, then another, and another, until the entire park rose in ovation. Claire didn't bow. She simply smiled with serenity, eyes slightly misty, and picked up her mother's handkerchief. She put the violin away carefully and stood there for a moment, looking at him, the Swan still calm, as if he were part of the music. The elderly woman approached and said softly, "That wasn't just a performance, my dear. It was a reunion." The performance had ended, but no one wanted to leave. People remained in their seats, some standing, gazing at the lake's edge, where the black swan stood still, calm, motionless, almost ceremonial. Claire, still on stage, gently packed up her violin, handling it with the same care as always. The white handkerchief with the letter M was folded with special tenderness and placed once again on the case. It was no longer just a symbol of memory. It had become a living part of what had just taken place. She stepped down from the stage to continued applause and was approached by several people. "You need to share this in other places. Have you thought about recording that piece? I work at a production company. Maybe we could talk." Claire responded politely, but her mind was still by the lake. The performance hadn't been a show, it was a reunion, and any attempt to turn that moment into a product felt off. The elderly woman approached slowly, as always. She said nothing at first. She just took Claire's hand and gently squeezed it. "It was the quietest music I've ever heard," she said, "and maybe the truest." Claire didn't respond right away. She looked toward the lake. The Swan was now gliding away, slowly returning to the center of the water, but before disappearing into the light mist that had begun to form over the surface, he turned his head toward her one last time. It was brief, but it was enough. That night, Claire politely declined every invitation she had received. She wasn't there for fame or followers, or to launch herself on platforms. She wanted something simpler, and for that reason something deeper. She decided that her music would become an instrument of presence. She began visiting nursing homes, hospital waiting rooms, quiet libraries. She played without spotlights, without schedules, just her violin and the certainty that each note carried a story of listening and staying. On one of those days, she brought presents to a group of children in recovery. After hearing it, one of them walked up to her and said, "It feels like that music talks to us," without using words. Claire smiled. That's exactly how it was born. The Swan never approached again during a performance, but he was always there, somewhere on the lake, a constant presence, and that was enough. The park had returned to its usual rhythm. Children ran between the trees, couples strolled by, elderly men read newspapers in the shade. The concert platform had been dismantled, and the lake had gone back to being just a calm mirror between the wooden benches. But for Claire, nothing was as it was before. She still returned to the same bench, not every day, but often enough for the silence to recognize her. The violin was always with her, and her mother's handkerchief remained folded inside the case. The black swan was still there. He didn't always come close. Sometimes he swam in wide, distant circles. Other times he stood still near the edge, simply watching. But Claire knew. It wasn't distance, it was trust. Their bond no longer needed proof. She began playing in places where sound was rarely welcomed. Hospital hallways, quiet shelters, waiting rooms where time seemed to stall. She played for people who couldn't speak, and for others who no longer wanted to listen. And with every melody, she carried a piece of that first silent presence by the lake. One day, back at the park, she found the elderly woman again, sitting on the same bench, a notebook resting in her lap. "I wrote something," the woman said, handing her a page. "After that night." Claire read silently. "Not all healing comes from touch. Sometimes it comes from the sound that lingers after the music ends, and from the gaze that remains when everyone else has gone." They smiled. Nothing more needed to be said. In the final scene, Claire sits once again by the lake. The sun sets slowly, painting the water in golden hues. The black swan rests on the opposite shore. She doesn't play, she just watches. And finally, with the violin still in her lap, she whispers softly, "Thank you for staying." She closes her eyes, and silence gently fills everything. If this story moved you, give it a like and share it with someone who also believes in the power of presence and silent listening. Have you ever found an unexpected bond during a difficult time, or met someone who stayed when everyone else walked away? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. We'll see you in the next video. And don't forget, sometimes healing comes from the one who says nothing, but stays.